Hello, I'm Michael Bunch. I'm the plant pathologist at the North Dakota State University Carrington Research Extension Center. I'd like to take a moment to share with you the results from our fungicide application timing research in navy beans. I'd like to stress that this research evaluates the question of when you should spray the fungicides, when targeting white mold, when conditions favor white mold as the navy beans enter bloom. Okay, if conditions do not favor white mold as the dry beans enter bloom, of course you should delay until conditions favor white mold. But we were testing when you should spray, when you know conditions favor white mold as the navy beans enter bloom. The testing was conducted on navy beans seeded to either 14 or 28-inch rows and 100,000 or 110,000 viable seeds an acre. Spray volume of 15 gallons an acre. These are applications made with a handheld boom, okay, pressurized by carbon dioxide. Fungicide droplet size was medium in a study conducted in 2017 and otherwise calibrated relative to canopy characteristics in 2020 to 2022. Okay, when we did 2 sequential fungicide applications, the interval between applications was 10 to 14 days. Testing was conducted with 6, 10, or 16 experimental replicates depending on the study. Typically, it was 10 to 16 experimental replicates. Only one of the studies was at 6 experimental replicates. The reason for doing a lot of replicates, and this is the number of times the treatments are randomized across the footprint of a study, is because spatially white mold pressure can be quite different. And by randomizing your treatments a larger number of times, you even out the impact of spatial differences in disease pressure. Okay, and so we want to make sure that we're getting unbiased results, and this allows us to do that. Okay, we assess white mold by assessing individual plants for white mold severity. Minimum half the plants per plot with those assessments made at or near maturity. Okay, we actually clip the plants at the base concurrent with white mold assessments and windrow them and pass those through the combine. This is very similar to knifing in terms of, it's identical to knifing in terms of its harvest. Okay, so the plants get windrowed, dried down, and then passed to the combine. We do that rather than direct harvest because we often have some degree of lodging in the studies, and that lodging is not well correlated to disease management. It has everything to do with other factors. Okay, and if we were to straight harvest, we'd get a lot of variability in our yield caused by the differential lodging, and that would obscure our ability to evaluate the impact of fungicide application timing on white mold management and associated yields. And so for that reason, we do not straight harvest. We actually essentially knife the beans and windrow them and then pick up the knifed beans. Okay, and so that gives us rigorous yield data that does not have any confounding variables of lodging obscuring our results. Okay, these are irrigated studies with irrigation managed as needed to facilitate white mold pressure. Okay, so what did we learn? Okay, what you see here are bar graphs that show the results for the average results across studies, and in this case the average results across 3 studies, and then you see a scatter plot. Okay, and the circles show the yield gain conferred by the fungicide in an individual study. The bars show the average yield gain conferred by the fungicide across all of the studies. And what the scatter plot allows you to see is the consistency of the response across studies. Okay, now these are studies in which the temperatures were quite warm as the navy beans enter bloom. They were in the upper 80s for daytime highs as the dry beans enter bloom, thus what you would classify as more moderate white mold risk as the dry beans enter bloom. Okay, when we did a single fungicide application, you notice that there was a penalty to applying too early. The results are classified by the percent of plants with initial pin pods. So when a dry bean blossom senesces, it immediately produces this tiny pin-shaped pod that we call a pin pod. and it's a 1/4 inch long or so, and it's very easy to assess the percent of plants with initial pin pods. What we do is we go out to every non-treated control in our study. So if there are 10 replicates, there are 10 of these non-treated controls, and we look at an arbitrary spot. We look at 10 plants in a row at that arbitrary spot and look how many of those have pin pods. Okay, you can do the same thing in your field. Walk out to the area of the field that you're worried about white mold. Go at a minimum 10 spots, and each of those spots look at 10 plants in a row. Look at how many have pin pods. The number of plants with pin pods translates directly into the number of plants with dead blossoms, and because white mold impact enters the plant only through the dead blossoms, this is an excellent assessment of the percent of plants that are susceptible to white mold. Okay. When we did a single fungicide application, you can see we got our optimum disease management with a single application made when 65 to 96% of plants had initial pin pods. When we applied earlier, we did not get as good disease control, okay, and we got lower yields. When we did 2 sequential fungicide applications, you can see that our yields were actually optimized by spraying a little bit earlier, when 21 to 50% of plants had initial pin pods. Okay, and there is again a penalty to applying too early, but now you also see a bit of a penalty to applying too late. So what about when it's cooler as you enter bloom? Okay, what you can see here is that these are studies, total of 3 studies, average response across 3 studies now, where temperatures were right around 80 degrees Fahrenheit for daytime highs as those dry beans enter bloom. So much more high risk for white mold, right? And what you can see right away is that when we did a single fungicide application, it was obliterated by white mold. One application wasn't enough, okay? And so now we only really have informative results under these conditions for 2 sequential applications. What you can see immediately is the same thing we saw before. It looks like there's a penalty to applying too early and a penalty to applying too late. And in this case, we optimized when about 3 to 20% of plants had initial pin spots. So the moment you had any dead blossoms out there, you had to have your fungicide out there, okay? And you need to have 2 applications. Okay, so let's summarize what we've learned. What these results indicate is that if you're going to do a single fungicide application to navy beans, you better make sure the disease pressure isn't too high, because a single fungicide application will not carry you to the end of the season if disease pressure is high. If the disease pressure is quite moderate, okay, then a single fungicide application can be somewhat effective, but you better wait until you're at about 65 to 95% of plants with initial pin pods. If you're going to do 2 sequential fungicide applications, you want to put that first application on when at the initial sign of pin pods. So 3 to 20% of plants with initial pin pods if it's really cool and highly favorable for white mold. And you can delay just a bit. This is just like probably 2 days to 20 to 50% of plants with initial pin pods if temperatures are warmer. Okay. So let's discuss a little bit more what we learned here. We saw that there was a penalty to applying too late. We saw this with the 2 application sequences, irrespective of whether it was really cool or quite warm, i.e. highly favorable white mold or less favorable. There was always a penalty to applying too late. And this is because the fungicides do not cure existing infections. A few of our modern fungicides give us a little bit of kickback activity up to 24 hours after that pathogen infects. Other ones do not give us any curative, okay? But even the ones that give us some curative activity, they perform better if you get the fungicide on before infection. And remember, 24 hours of curative activity is still a good 2 weeks before you usually see white mold show up visually. And so this is a microscopic level of infection. And so what we've learned here is what we've always known. You have to get your fungicide on before the pathogen infects. And that pathogen infection occurs long before you see any disease out in the canopy. But we also learned here is that there's a penalty to applying too early. And this is what people usually forget. What happens when you spray that fungicide, you're protecting the growth that is out there at that time. You're not protecting the new growth that comes in afterwards. Okay, so you spray your fungicide, all the growth that's out there at that time gets protected if you're able to get the fungicide to that tissue. Okay, and then the new growth is unprotected. So if you spray 5 days before pathogen infection, that means you have 5 days of new growth that will not be protected by that fungicide. If you spray 1 day before pathogen infection, on the other hand, you only have 1 day of new growth not protected by the fungicide, and you can see you're going to get much better activity out of that fungicide. So what we have learned is that there's a penalty to applying too late and a penalty to applying too early, and because the dry beans are putting on lots of new growth at early bloom, this second part is really tricky. Okay, and just to illustrate what I mean with a penalty to applying too early, look at these field peas. These field peas were sprayed targeting powdery mildew at initial bloom. At the end of the season, you can see the bottom part of that canopy is totally whistle clean. There's no powdery mildew on it at all. Okay, but the upper part of the canopy has tons of powdery mildew. What happened is that after we sprayed, the field peas continued growing upward, and at the end of the season, that new growth was unprotected and got powdery mildew. And the earlier growth that was present when we sprayed that fungicide was protected. The exact same thing happens on dry beans. So this creates challenges, right? First off, you can see even with optimal timing, our disease management was not that great. 50% control is considered good, and that's not very good. Okay. Second, applying at that perfect timing that can give you maybe that 50% control is hard. Okay, so most fields do not have completely consistent driving growth and development across the field. There are areas that are a little bit farther ahead and areas that are a little bit farther behind. Okay, so you might be at the optimal application timing in one part of the field, but not the other. The second part is that, of course, not every day is suitable for spraying, and you can move from 20% of plants with pin pods to 50% of plants with pin pods in 2 days. And so it's very difficult to target these applications timings. And so what do we do about that? Okay, we can't do anything about the fact that we can't cure existing infections. So we have to get on before the pathogen infects. But we can do something about the penalty to applying too early. And that would be by tightening the interval between applications. Okay, so rather than applying it 10 to 14 days between applications, we apply it 7 days between applications. And in theory, that should help us apply a little bit on the early side if we need to. Okay, if you look at that forecast and you think, oh, when this hits 20% pin pod, it looks like I'm going to be socked in by rain. This field is going to be too muddy. Well, then, you can go on maybe a little bit earlier, but then you apply that second application just 7 days later to protect that new growth a little bit earlier, and that should make up for that penalty to applying too early. The problem is that now you've made that second application a lot earlier, and it might not protect at the end of the season. So now you might need a third application. And so to evaluate this question in 2024, we started to conduct application timing, interval, and frequency research. And I would suggest that you reference the results that I've posted online showing the results from that research. We have only conducted research thus far on pinto beans and kidney beans, non-navy beans, but hopefully these results can help inform your approach to navy beans as well. Before I close, I'd like to give sincere thanks to my staff, Aaron Faust, Ron Callis, and Jesse Hafner, Gabby Henson. These individuals are highly dedicated. They work very long hours. Without their dedication and their hard work, this work would not be possible. I'd also like to thank the staff in Oaks who also contributed towards these fungicide timing studies. Again, they are highly dedicated, hardworking staff, and their help is critical for the success of this work. Finally, I'd like to give sincere thanks to the funding agencies that made this possible. The grant dollars from the North Harvest Bean Growers Association, the North Dakota Crop Protection Product and Harmonization and Registration Board, administered by the North Dakota Department of Agriculture, and the USDA Specialty Crop Block Grant Program, administered by the North Dakota Department of Agriculture. These grant funds made it possible to pay our staff and also pay for the supplies necessary to run this research. Okay, I'd also like to give sincere thanks to the private companies that do contract testing with us, because it is the funding from that testing that allows us to purchase the farm equipment necessary to do this research. Okay, so that means our combine, our tractors, our sprayers, etc. Okay, finally, I'd like to thank Bollingberg Seeds, Green Valley Bean, and Kelly Bean for donating the seed that was utilized in this fungicide timing research. In this case, specifically Kelly Bean, that donated the navy bean seed. Sincere thanks to Kelly Bean in Hatton and Dean Nelson for donating that to us. That helps us a lot, and we are very grateful. With that, thank you for your time and attention. I hope this research is of use to improving your operations.